or something, you would throw your lamp at a teammate and it would bounce off their head and like fly in the other direction. That's what you could compare it to.
What if a demon of shadow and flame were to obtain the greatest weapon in the history of Middle-earth? What power could such a being wield? And with whom would it ally? Today on Nerd of the Rings, we put our regular research into determining what would happen if the Balrog got the One Ring. As always, we pick up our tale at the most likely point of deviation. Unquestionably, today's scenario is when the Fellowship is making their way through the now decrepit realm of Khazad-dûm. Moria, the Black Pit it is now called, and it is home to bands of orcs and a great dark menace. The date is January 15, 3019. The Fellowship discovers the Chamber of Mazarbul, where they are attacked by a group of orcs before making their escape. As the other 8 members flee through the eastern doorway, Gandalf stands to hold the passage. There, through the closed door, he senses a great power, a counterspell working against his own. As the door bursts asunder, he sees the room enveloped in shadow. The wall and the chamber collapse, and Gandalf returns to the Fellowship, leading them to the bridge of Khazad-dûm. It came to the edge of the fire, and the light faded as if a cloud had bent over it. Then with a rush, it leaped across the fissure. The flames roared up to greet it, and wreathed around it, and a black smoke swirled in the air. Its streaming mane kindled and blazed behind it. In its right hand was a blade like a stabbing tongue of fire. In its left, it held a whip of many thongs. Here Gandalf and the Balrog known as Durin's Bane face off upon the bridge. But what if, rather than falling together, the Balrog is victorious? With a snap, the Balrog lashes his whip at the Grey Wizard, binding his arms to his side. With a great tug, Gandalf is flung forward, impaled upon the fiery blade. In this, his final moment, Gandalf knows he has failed. The Balrog lifts the wizard and with a casual flick, drops him into the abyss below. Before they know it, the Fellowship is attacked by the great demon, and no horn, nor bow, nor sword can withstand its coming. With great swipes of its sword and whip, the Balrog kills the Fellowship. Last of all stands a small creature, with drawn sword glowing blue. For reasons not fully known to itself, the Balrog grabs the creature in his hands, and it is enveloped in flame. The creature is reduced to ash, and its blade is but a melted pool of metal. And yet, something remains. A gold band with a glowing red script, a mysterious object that withstood the great fire of Durin's Bane. The One Ring rests in the hand of the Balrog of Morgoth. But what would the Balrog do with such a ring of power? To better inform his next moves, we must debunk a common misconception about Balrogs. They are no mindless beasts. While their depiction is often gigantic creatures of brute strength, their power was more magical, and their presence more human. Moments before his face-off with Gandalf, the Balrog is described as a dark form of somewhat man-shaped yet greater. Given its counterspell against Gandalf, it clearly has more than just size and strength at its disposal, though their stature was certainly great, and their fire and power wrought great destruction. Standing in Moria, his enemies vanquished, this being of the same order as Gandalf and Sauron looks upon the One Ring in his hand. It perceives the great power contained within, as the ring seems to grow in size, just as both Isildur and Bilbo had observed during their time possessing it. The Balrog places the ring upon his finger, feeling his own power amplified. He finds the orcs of Moria flocking to his side, drawn to the leadership of the Balrog. Just as Gothmog, the lord of Balrogs of old, Durin's Bane now captains a great force of orcs. And with his now greater power, he seeks to resume his glorious purpose from the days of Morgoth, bring wanton destruction and darkness. For it was the Balrogs, not Sauron, who were most like Morgoth himself. As we find in the Silmarillion, in Utumno, Melkor gathered his demons about him, those spirits who first adhered to him in the days of his splendor, and became most like him in his corruption. The Balrog and his orcs exit the nearby East Gate of Moria, and looking out upon the lands of Middle-earth for the first time in over 6,000 years, he espies the nearby forest of Lorien. Over the coming week, the realm of Lorien is consumed in fire and death. Ultimately, the power of Galadriel and her ring are no match for the power of the One and its wielder. In the early days of this struggle, Sauron becomes aware of the Balrog wielding his ring, and is forced to act even earlier than the canon story by nearly 2 months. However, rather than dealing with a mere mortal claiming his ring, he knows the danger the Balrog poses to his very existence. His only option is to come forth from Mordor personally, with a show of force to meet the Balrog, in hopes it will ultimately choose to serve him, Morgoth's chief lieutenant. Orcs are summoned from throughout Mordor, along with the Nazgul. After 2 weeks of preparation, the Dark Lord leads what forces he can out from the Black Gate. All the while, there are others who have learned of what has transpired. Saruman and Denethor, both possessing Palantiri, and having similar, though different connections to the Dark Lord, are also aware of the great threat in Lorien. Sauron orders Saruman to send his forces to join his own in the Eastmark of Rohan, a realm still under Saruman's sway, as there is no visit from Gandalf to heal Theoden. But Saruman sees this move for what it is, further manipulation by the Dark Lord. Should the Balrog fall in line under Sauron, the wizard would be, at best, 3rd greatest in the new power structure of the world. Saruman instead forms plans of his own. Through his servant Wormtongue, he manipulates Theoden into contacting Denethor for aid. For Denethor's part, he is aware that there is a great danger approaching north of Rohan, though unlike Saruman, he does not have a full picture of what that danger is. Thus, when the call for aid comes from Theoden, Gondor will answer. Now, we don't know the exact number of soldiers that Minas Tirith has at their disposal at this moment. We know they will eventually receive 3,000 soldiers from the southern fiefs, but that will not have happened at this point. Thus, Gondor will send a more conservative 1,500 soldiers from Minas Tirith, while simultaneously putting out the call to the southern fiefs earlier than the canon tale for reinforcements. Meanwhile, the Rohirrim muster their riders, not under Theoden, who remains ill, but his son Theodred, who was never killed, as Saruman had not yet made his first attack upon Rohan to do so. With a Rohan that has not suffered the losses of 2 battles at the Fords of Isen and the Battle of Helm's Deep, they have more soldiers than they would have otherwise. Instead of the 6,000 they take in the canon tale to Minas Tirith, they assemble at least 8,000 Rohirrim, possibly closer to 10. Bolstered by the fighters of Gondor, they now amass at least a 10,000 strong army. As these armies of Isengard, Rohan, and Mordor assemble, the Balrog is likewise unexpectedly bolstered. For nearby Dol Guldur, Sauron had a secondary force of orcs, the ones that in the canon tale lead attacks on Lorien and Thranduil's realm in March 3019. Viewing the destruction of Lorien across the river, the orcs of Dol Guldur join those of Moria in their destruction of Lorien. We will see the ring have an effect on the Balrog. It begins to feel a pull toward the south, the home of the ring's creator. And as with any creature, the ring enhances the natural abilities of its wearer. For hobbits and other mortals, it makes them invisible. For great commanders, it would lead soldiers to flock to their banner. And for powerful beings of an angelic order, demons of shadow and flame, it would increase this power. Thus the Balrog would, like Sauron, send forth a darkening cloud of foreboding, concealing the sunlight in the lands to which it moved. Thus fire consumes the forest of Fangorn, and the Ents are no more. Due to proximity and being most prepared for action, Saruman's army of orcs, uruks, goblin men, and half-orcs meet the forces of the Balrog south of Fangorn Forest. There, the White Wizard makes his move. His orcs deliver Saruman's message, warning that even now, Sauron himself was approaching with an army. made of as many as 30,000 to take the ring by force. Due to the earlier time frame, Sauron's forces are not yet bolstered by the Haradrim and Easterlings, and as a token of his loyalty, Saruman's orcs align with those of the Balrog. Should the Balrog prove victorious, Saruman will be on the winning side, and perhaps through later treachery, will take the ring from his fellow Maya. Should Sauron prove victorious, he will claim that his orc army betrayed him after encountering the Balrog, wielding the One Ring. Yet his insurance is the Rohirrim, a 10,000-strong cavalry which will wreak havoc upon whatever force remains, and cripple the force of Sauron or the Balrog, enough perhaps for Saruman to betray the victor. The Balrog and Sauron and their forces meet upon the Wold, where the mouth of Sauron, face to face with the great demon, makes the best case for victory, that the Balrog should fall in line, giving the ring back to Sauron himself, the chief lieutenant of Morgoth. But would the Balrog view Sauron as his superior? The case can be made either way. Sauron was indeed Morgoth's chief lieutenant, yet the Balrogs were no mere underlings. They were the mightiest of Morgoth's forces. Gothmog, their lord, was the high captain of Angband, yet Sauron was certainly the heir apparent to Morgoth. The Balrog walks past the mouth of Sauron, approaching the Dark Lord himself, submitting to him. Sauron approaches, the prized ring returning at last. But through the ring, the Balrog had perceived the Dark Lord's mind. Far had he strayed from their master's ways. Sauron sought to lord over Middle-earth. Morgoth would have brought destruction and chaos. No, Sauron was not worthy of this prize. The Balrog grabbed Sauron by the neck. The ring is his. Claiming the ring for his own and putting forth his full power, Sauron is consumed in flame, and his body is once again destroyed. Sauron's forces are consumed with fear at seeing their great leader defeated before their eyes. The Balrog would be the destroyer his captain once was, yet greater. In awe and fear, just as they serve Sauron, the orcs of Mordor join the Balrog. When the Saruman-influenced army of men arrives, it is to find not a battlefield of two decimated armies, but a united force of darkness. The men of the West fight valiantly to defend the lands of Rohan, and bring great destruction upon the unmounted orcs. Yet they are no match for the might of the Balrog. Eomer, Theodred, and all save a couple hundred men are slain. The survivors ride back to Edoras, bringing word to King Theoden. Realizing everything has gone wrong, Wormtongue abandons Rohan, riding with all speed to Orthanc, hoping for the protection of Saruman. Eowyn now aids the king, and they lead their people to Helm's Deep to prepare for a potential attack by the orc armies of the Balrog. In their care are the wounded from the previous battle, including a young captain of Gondor. Yet the Balrog does not make for Rohan, instead traveling to the stronghold of his unforeseen ally, Saruman. For his part, Saruman pledges fealty to this new ultimate power in Middle-earth, and seeks to become his chief advisor. Meanwhile, the Nazgul are dispatched to Mordor, summoning the remainder of Sauron's armies to make their great war upon the world of men. Thus, the power and might of the Balrog wreaks havoc upon the world, and Middle-earth is engulfed in darkness and flame. The Witch King leads the southern armies in a successful siege upon Minas Tirith, crippling the final realm of men standing in their way. Meanwhile, the Balrog and his northern forces travel north from Isengard, heading toward Rivendell and the last remaining Elven Ring of Power, possessed by Elrond. The power of the Balrog only grows in its mastering of the One Ring, and it begins to realize that the complete destruction of Middle-earth is not only within its grasp, but inevitable. And maybe, with its newfound power, it can destroy the very door of night, and summon back from the void Morgoth himself. Now, admittedly, this is one of the more wild and crazy theories I've had. There just simply isn't a whole lot to go off of when it comes to the Balrog possessing the ring, though it's a very safe bet that nothing good would come of it. But now I turn it over to you. How would you have this scenario play out? And what other what-ifs would you like to see here on the channel?
Vengeance is a cruel mistress.
The fires of the Balrog have spread throughout the lands of Gondor and have begun to take the northlands of Eriador. Saruman is for now safe in his role as lieutenant of Durin's Bane, though if he wishes for any of Middle-earth to be left for himself to rule, he knows he must act soon. Meanwhile, word has spread to the few remaining kingdoms left standing, the dwarves of Erebor, the men of Dale, and the elves of Mirkwood. As they unite and begin debating what to do, an old figure exits the east gate of Moria, resurrected, given new power, and risen from the depths of Moria, Gandalf the White returns to Middle-earth. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings. Today's video is brought to you by a long-expected soundscape. An incredible, fully immersive audio experience bringing The Lord of the Rings to life. You won't want to miss the details about this new way of exploring the trilogy and getting my special discount code to help you dive in. Welcome everyone to Nerd of the Rings. Today we are tackling a question I get asked a lot. For those unfamiliar, for these videos I begin with the most likely starting point of the scenario. I then go through my usual research process of dates, travel distances, but also quotes from the books and Tolkien himself that give us clues as to how this might play out. Today we tackle the question, what if Saruman got the One Ring? First, let's establish some things about Saruman prior to the War of the Ring. By the time we meet Saruman in The Lord of the Rings, he has coveted the One Ring for quite some time. While it might be a bit nebulous to fans of the films, in the books we learn Saruman left the path of good long ago. After spending his first almost 1500 years in Middle-earth in the lands of Rhûn, Saruman returns to the Westlands and is made the leader of the White Council in 2463 of the Third Age. This is the very year Deagol and Smeagol find the One Ring in the River Anduin. Over the next 300 years, Saruman would spend a great deal of time in Minas Tirith, researching its vast archives. It is here he learns a Palantir is likely still in Orthanc. Though the topic he researches most throughout his years in Middle-earth, and indeed becomes an expert in, is the Rings of Power. Saruman would move to Orthanc in 2759, with both Rohan and Gondor welcoming an ally at their northern border. Nearly 100 years later, in 2851, at a meeting of the White Council, Gandalf claims that Sauron has returned to Dol Guldur and says the Council should attack. However, Saruman believes that as Sauron builds his strength, the One Ring would reveal itself. He overrules Gandalf, and this is the moment, nearly 200 years before the War of the Ring, that we know for certain that Saruman desires the One Ring for himself. Over the coming centuries, Saruman would play his game with the Council, posing as their ally, while secretly making moves that would put him in the place of supreme power. Around 2990 of the Third Age, he begins breeding his army of orcs, which would be concealed, kept secret in the tunnels burrowed beneath Isengard. 10 years later, through his use of the Palantir, Saruman would become partially subservient to Sauron, as the latter affects him through the Seeing Stone. But as we learn from Gandalf's meeting with Saruman in the Fellowship of the Ring, Saruman was not wholly a loyal servant of Sauron. He came and laid his long hand on my arm. "And why not, Gandalf?" he whispered. "Why not? The ruling ring. If we could command that, then the power would pass to us. That is in truth why I brought you here, for I have many eyes in my service. And I believe that you know where this precious thing now lies." Is it not so? Or why do the Nine ask for the Shire? And what is your business there? As he said this, a lust which he could not conceal shone suddenly in his eyes. Saruman, Gandalf said, standing away from him, only one hand at a time can wield the wand, and you know that well. So do not trouble to say we, but I would not give it, nay, I would not give even news of it to you. Now that I learn your mind, you were head of the council, but you have unmasked yourself at last. Well, the choices are, it seems, to submit to Sauron or to yourself. I will take neither. We'll return to the text throughout the video, but for now, let's begin with where the canon turns to theory. In my mind, there is truly one starting point for a scenario where Saruman would have received the One Ring, when his orcs attack the Fellowship at Amon Hen. As we know, the Fellowship is on the western side of the Anduin when they are waylaid by orcs and Uruk-hai from Isengard and Mordor. In this scenario, we make the small change in that it is not Merry and Pippin who are captured, but Frodo and Sam. Boromir is still slain by the orcs, leaving Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, and Pippin to decide their course of action. As the remaining Fellowship regroups, the band of orcs sets out across the plains of Rohan, heading northwest to Isengard. Unlike the canon story, Aragorn's path is quite clear. He must pursue the orcs carrying Frodo and Sam, or else all will be lost. However, the great run of the three hunters, where just over 3 days they cover 45 leagues, or 155 miles, would not be possible with Merry and Pippin in tow. Realizing this shortly into their journey, Aragorn and Legolas continue the pursuit, while leaving Gimli to protect and lead the hobbits. Aragorn sends the trio toward Edoras, in hopes of warning the Rohirrim and gaining an ally. Now, in the canon story, Éomer, while in Edoras, hears of the orcs traveling through Rohan from the Emyn Muil, and the following day, on March 27th, he would set out from the East Fold, against Theoden's orders, to intervene. As this theory is contingent upon Saruman getting the One Ring, we could say that perhaps Éomer obeyed Theoden's orders. Or, more interestingly, Éomer encounters not the orcs, but Gimli and the hobbits making their way toward Edoras. This delay allows the orcs to return to Orthanc with their prey. Meanwhile, Aragorn and Legolas travel the edge of Fangorn Forest, following the path of the Uruks. They are met by a figure cloaked in white, who reveals himself to be a resurrected Gandalf. Whether by force or by the power and persuasion of his voice, Saruman gets the ring from Frodo Baggins. Placing it on his finger, the bearers of the three rings immediately know of Saruman's possession. Gandalf takes off his Ring of Fire, lest he risk falling under Saruman's control. He turns to Aragorn, saying they must make haste to Rohan, not Isengard, for the ring is already with Saruman, and they must rally what forces they can. But the wizard Saruman is cunning, and will not waste the opportunity to use others to his advantage. Despite placing the ring upon his finger, he does not claim it as his own. For now, he possesses it, but does not claim it. Instead, he reveals to Sauron in the Palantir that he now has the ring, and feigns loyalty to the Dark Lord. As we know, the One Ring enhances the natural abilities and powers of its wearer. For Saruman, perhaps greater than any magic he wielded, was the power in his voice. Let's return to the canon story for a moment to realize the power of Saruman's voice. We see after Isengard's defeat, Gandalf warns the others to beware the voice of Saruman, and Tolkien tells us of the effect of those who were not prepared or strong enough to resist it. Suddenly another voice spoke, low and melodious, its very sound an enchantment. Those who listened unwarily to that voice could seldom report the words that they heard, and if they did, they wondered, for little power remained in them. Mostly they remembered only that it was a delight to hear the voice speaking. All that is said seemed wise and reasonable, and desire awoke in them by swift agreement to seem wise themselves. When others spoke, they seemed harsh and uncouth by contrast, and if they gainsaid the voice, anger was kindled in the hearts of those under the spell. For some, the spell lasted only while the voice spoke to them, and when it spake to another they smiled, as men do who see through a juggler's trick while others gape at it. For many, the sound of the voice alone was enough to hold them enthralled. But for those whom it conquered, the spell endured when they were far away, and ever they heard that soft voice whispering and urging them. But none were unmoved. None rejected its pleas and its commands without an effort of mind and will, so long as its master had control of it. Earlier in the book, we learn that Saruman's voice not only worked on men, but on the mightiest of the servants of Sauron. When the Nazgul arrive at Isengard seeking the Shire, Saruman claims to not know where it lies, telling them they should instead seek Gandalf nearby. Here, Tolkien states, such was still the power of the voice of Saruman that even the Lord of the Nazgul did not question what it said, whether it was false or short of the full truth. But straight away he rode from the gate and began to hunt for Gandalf in Rohan. Using the One Ring, Saruman feigns his loyalty to Sauron, saying he will dutifully hand it over, but first, Sauron must attack Gondor to prevent their rallying with Rohan to attack Isengard. Sauron agrees, though he is also troubled, for Saruman's treachery is already known to him. As the month of March dawns, Gandalf, Aragorn, and Legolas arrive in Edoras. There, Gandalf heals Theoden, and in turn releases the captured Gimli, Merry, and Pippin, who found an unfriendly welcome when they arrived a day earlier. With Theoden renewed, the Rohirrim are mustered to take the fight to Saruman, in hopes they could defeat him through combined strength, before Saruman has a chance to further build his forces or rally others to his banner. Much like what transpires in the books, Theoden musters the Rohirrim to make war upon Saruman. Though with the peril of the situation known thanks to Gandalf, he first sends word to Minas Tirith, asking for aid from Denethor. Saruman, now in possession of the ring, has no need to make a rushed and swift attack upon Rohan as he does in the canon tale. Instead, he is content to fortify Isengard against any coming threat. In Unfinished Tales, when the Nazgul come to Orthanc, we are told that even the company of the Witch King could not assail the Circle of Isengard because it was too strong. It could only be attacked by a great strength of war. Knowing they are likely riding to a siege, Theoden takes the additional time to summon riders from throughout Rohan, including sending out riders to find and retrieve Erkenbrand and his 1,000 riders to swell their numbers. Meanwhile, Gandalf rides out of Edoras on an unknown errand, pledging to return. In total, it is likely Theoden musters at least 6,000 riders, the same number that in the canon story rides to Minas Tirith, and double the 3,000 that are present at the Battle of Helm's Deep. The 6,000 plus Rohirrim ride to encircle Isengard and begin the siege. This cuts off any potential reinforcements from Dunland, Mordor, or the Misty Mountains. All the while, they hope that Gondor will answer their call. However, in the east, Sauron's forces are on the move. Rather than being alerted to Pippin and Aragorn in the Palantir on March 5th and 6th respectively, Sauron has been contacted by Saruman possessing the ring at the end of February. Thus, the siege of Minas Tirith instead begins on March 9th. Any chance of Denethor aiding the Rohirrim is gone, for Gondor must look to its own defense. While still formidable, Sauron's force attacking Gondor is notably different from the canon story. Since the attack comes sooner, there are no corsairs yet making their way up the river through the southern fiefdoms. And while many orcs are still present at the siege, the Witch King is not. The orc chieftain Gothmog commands Mordor's forces at the Pelennor Fields. As the Witch King, all the Nazgul, and a force of Haradrim and Easterlings have already marched from the Black Gate toward Isengard days earlier. For Sauron knows he cannot trust Saruman, but nor can he allow Gondor to aid in his defeat, lest the ring come to Aragorn or Gandalf. As this force must travel with all possible speed, Sauron does not afford the time to send forth his Veil of Darkness, leaving his orcs behind so as not to slow the host's progress in daylight. The Rohirrim are seemingly left alone in their attack, until Gandalf the White appears leading not a group of Rohirrim, but a group of Ents. The Ents attack the walls of Isengard, finally breaching the Great Circle. However, as they and the Rohirrim enter, they are met not with a small feeble defense as in the actual story, but a mighty army numbering over 10,000 strong. Even with inferior numbers, the Rohirrim and Ents may yet have undoubtedly won the day. were it not for the devices of Saruman. For since it had not been sent to breach Helm's Deep, Saruman's forces use his blasting fire to terrible effect against the Ents and Rohirrim. As the battle rages on, in doubt of who will prevail, 9 fell beasts begin to circle overhead as Sauron's northern host arrives. Saruman's betrayal of both sides of the war has now come to haunt him. While Sauron's forces are an enemy to all, if the Witch King focuses on Saruman, which he will undoubtedly do at the command of his master, all could be lost. His true allegiance to only himself, undoubtedly known to all, Saruman does what he had refrained from doing for the past 12 days. He places the One Ring upon his finger and fully claims it for his own. The immediate result of this is the Nazgul come under Saruman's command. As Saruman had told the Witch King when they came to Orthanc seeking the Shire, "I know what you seek, though you do not name it. I have it not, as surely its servants perceive without telling. For if I had it, then you would bow before me and call me Lord." We see this is not a mere theory of Saruman's, but it is also known to others. In the end, the Nazgul are servants of the One Ring, not its creator. When Frodo was in Lorien, he asked Galadriel why, as ring-bearer, he couldn't control the Nazgul. Galadriel responds, "Before you could use that power, you would need to become far stronger, and to train your will to the domination of others." If anyone in Middle-earth other than Sauron were equipped to ensnare and command the Nazgul, it would be Saruman, one who has excelled in manipulation and using others to his own purposes. With the Nazgul under his command, Saruman turns the tide of battle. The Witch King's forces join with Isengard and rout the Rohirrim. Aragorn, Theoden, Legolas, Gimli, Eomer, and thousands more lay dead, and Gandalf the White is subdued. While a fight between the upgraded Gandalf the White and a ring-wielding Saruman would make for its own intriguing theory, a battle-weary and captured Gandalf would likely be no match for the might of Saruman. In this instance, we are reminded of an exchange between Saruman and Gandalf, leading to the latter's imprisonment. Saruman was cold now and perilous. "Yes," he said, "I did not expect you to show wisdom, even on your own behalf. But I gave you the chance of aiding me willingly, and so saving yourself much trouble and pain. The third choice is to stay here until the end." "Until what end?" "Until you reveal to me where the One may be found. I may find means to persuade you, or until it is found in your despite. And the ruler has time to turn to lighter matters, to devise, say, a fitting reward for the hindrance and insolence of Gandalf the Grey." Gandalf tells us his response was, "That may not prove to be one of the lighter matters," said I. He laughed at me, for my words were empty, and he knew it. Certainly as Gandalf the Grey, he knew he would stand no chance against a ring-bearing Saruman, and in a scenario where he is defeated and weary, he would no doubt be quickly eliminated by the new Lord of the Ring. But what of the original Lord of the Ring? In this instance, Saruman, being like Gandalf an emissary of the powers, a creature of the Order of the Maiar, and an immortal spirit taking physical form, would produce the same end result for Sauron as Gandalf taking the ring. Tolkien himself lays this out for us in Letter 246. If Gandalf proved the victor, the result would have been for Sauron the same as the destruction of the ring. For him, it would have been destroyed, taken from him forever. But the ring and all its works would have endured. It would have been the master in the end. Thus, Sauron is reduced to nothing more than a spirit, unable to ever again take physical form, as the ring is forever lost to him. His gambit to send his Nazgul to overtake Saruman has failed, and a new power has arisen. The Rohirrim, Gandalf, and the three hunters are dead upon the battlefield of Isengard. Saruman commands the refortifying of Isengard, keeping his surviving orcs alongside the Haradrim and Easterlings for his protection, led by the Nazgul. Days later, the Witch King and 5 Ringwraiths fly south on fell beasts, coming to a still-in-progress siege of Minas Tirith on March 15th. Khamul and the remaining 2 Nazgul are left behind to lead the defense of Orthanc. However, the Nazgul come not to wreak havoc upon Gondor, but upon Sauron's army. For Saruman would soon have no further need of foul orcs. His new world would be built upon men. The Nazgul rallied the Haradrim and Easterlings in turning on the Orcs. Their numbers are swelled this very day as the Corsairs, unhindered by Aragorn, arrive at the port of Harland. The Orcs are destroyed, and the symbol of the White Hand is seen as the deliverer of Gondor. The Witch King, as Saruman's emissary, tells Denethor that Minas Tirith, the men of Middle-earth, and even the Nazgul themselves have been freed from the tyranny of Sauron, thanks to Saruman Ringbearer, Saruman of many colors. Saruman in the coming days would make direct contact with Denethor through the Palantir. And while Denethor had for so long held off the influence of Sauron in the Palantir, his relief at the survival of Gondor and the defeat of the Dark Lord lowers his defenses, and the Steward enters into an alliance with Saruman. Together, they would amass an army to trample the last remaining threats to Saruman's rule, Lorien and Rivendell. With neither Galadriel nor Elrond able to wield the protective power of their rings, both realms will surely fall under the dominion of the One. Meanwhile, Sauron's northern force of Easterlings that attacks Erebor in the canon story is victorious, for there is no destruction of the ring to break their morale and turn the tide. With Saruman's conquest of Middle-earth complete, he would operate through his persuasive voice and his Nazgul to rally men of Gondor, Harad, and Rhûn under his banner, setting up lords and kings, all subservient to him. We see in the Scouring of the Shire that Saruman turns the land of the Halflings into an industrial nightmare made to benefit only himself. This is but a taste of what Saruman will do now that he commands the One Ring and great armies. All of Middle-earth will now be turned to the fires of industry, as Saruman uses all for his gain, craving ever more knowledge, rule, and order. It's certainly a bleak image should Saruman gain the One Ring. Now, if you enjoyed this theory or just enjoy Middle-earth in general, please hit that subscribe button as we pull ever closer to 1 million subscribers here on Nerd of the Rings. A young captain of Gondor wanders the lands that were long ago part of their realm. He is conflicted. He is loyal to Gondor and to his father, but that loyalty is at odds with what he knows in his heart. Peace in Gondor has come at too great a price for the peoples of Middle-earth. His company of loyal men meets another group on the road. Their leader confronts him, declaring that though it be not recognized by the tyrant of Isengard, these lands still belong to Rohan. It seems the captain of Gondor has met one who thinks as he does regarding their newfound overlord, and thus Faramir meets Éowyn. Now, I'm super excited to tell you about a long-expected soundscape.
The item is complete.
Not only will I be able to tell you about it, but I'll be able to show you firsthand what this incredible audio experience is like. I backed this project on Kickstarter back when it came out on Tolkien Reading Day in 2022. Let's do a walkthrough of what my friend Jordan Randalls has spent the last year creating for the Tolkien fandom. Jordan has created a 3D audio version of The Lord of the Rings. He went out into the woods to record nature sounds, some of which you're hearing right now. He then recorded and designed sound effects like the Balrog and the Ents. You can even hear some audio cameos of me as an orc growling and laughing in Moria and in Mordor. Next, Jordan has written an entire score for the trilogy, music that you've been listening to throughout this video. Every character has a theme. Every moment is scored specifically, not just looped background music. Let's break down what that really means. Jordan has composed and timed all of the score, sound effects, and ambience to Andy Serkis's audiobook. That means if you've bought them from someplace like Audible, you can play them at the same time and they will sync up perfectly. You can also just put the chapters on without the book and listen as you hear Gandalf's fireworks. The Rohirrim ride to meet Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Or even the vivid detail of Shelob as she battles with Sam.
The item is complete.
The depth and detail that Jordan has gone to create this project is truly incredible. Every moment has been thought through. How windy would it be on the higher levels of Minas Tirith? In what moments should his eucatastrophe motif be played? What does a Mumik really sound like? And how does it feel to have a fell beast fly above you? You can listen as you read. You can just listen. You can sync it up with Andy's audiobook, have it on with your D&D games, and so much more. The applications of this project are endless, and all you need is your computer or a podcast feed and a set of headphones to be able to sit down in a fully 3D immersive audio experience of The Lord of the Rings, mixed in Dolby Atmos. Now today is a very special day for the Soundscape, because I'm happy to announce that the Two Towers collection is officially here. You can use my promo code NERD25 to get 25% off of the entire trilogy collection. That means you'll get Fellowship of the Ring today, the Two Towers today, and within the next 3 months, the Return of the King as well. And if you want to try it out first, you can use the code NERD10 to get 10% off one of the 3 books. Seriously guys, you don't want to miss out on this experience, and yes, Jordan will be creating additional soundscapes for The Hobbit and The Silmarillion. So you definitely want to get in on this now, so that when those are launched, maybe you can even get your voice on them like I did. So check out jordanrannells.com and use the promo code NERD25 to experience the trilogy in a fantastic and completely new way. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil19, Listen Me the Cinda, Kella Brimbor, The Mighty Mim, Team Weasel, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, Toby Mob's Music, CCDC Red Team, Nerd Sidgman Anytimer, Pelkey Sports Cards, Mookie the Brown, Christopher Carbaugh, Joe Tepper, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Salim Rahman, Zetrock, Berto Berg, Grand Strategy Nerd, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, Grant McGregor, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Lord of the Rings. It is one of the greatest and longest-lasting realms of men in all Middle-earth. Rising from the ashes of Numenor, it would survive war, plague, and turmoil for over 3,000 years before finally seeing the return of the king. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we covered the history of Gondor. After the downfall of Numenor, the 5 ships of Isildur and Anarion were brought to the southern lands of Middle-earth, while their father Elendil and his 4 ships were taken north. In 3320 of the Second Age, the brothers continue their voyage up the Anduin River, landing in the heart of the new realm they would build, Gondor. While known as a great kingdom in later days, Gondor was initially subservient to Elendil's northern kingdom of Arnor. Isildur and Anarion rule as kings of Gondor, while Elendil rules over both realms as the High King. Isildur settles in and rules over the lands of Ithilien. He builds the Tower of Minas Ithil on the border of Gondor and Mordor as a direct threat to Sauron. Minas Ithil, meaning Tower of the Moon, is where Isildur plants the sapling of the White Tree of Nimloth, which he had saved from Numenor. Meanwhile, Anarion builds the city of Minas Anor, the Tower of the Sun, directly to the west across the river. Between their 2 cities, the brothers established the first capital of their realm, Osgiliath. The capital city is known for its beauty and has great stone bridges going over the river Anduin. Aside from the great craftsmanship shown in the construction of these 3 cities, the early Gondorians were also responsible for some of the most iconic monuments and buildings in all Middle-earth. The Second Age Gondorians constructed the Tower of Orthanc, made of unbreakable black stone. Another great black stone is one Isildur brings from Numenor, the Stone of Erech, upon which the King of the Mountains swears an oath that he will one day break. Gondor also builds a fortress within its realm of Calinarthon at Aglarond, also known as the Glittering Caves, with other wonders to follow in their later history. Among these great cities and fortresses are spread 4 of the 7 Palantiri, rescued from the fall of Numenor. Isildur and Anarion place one in each of their cities of Minas Anor and Minas Ithil. They place one in the capital of Osgiliath, and one is stationed in the Tower of Orthanc at the northern border of their realm. Among the citizens of this newly formed kingdom are men of Numenor who already lived in Middle-earth. These people, many of whom were among the faithful, and at least partially of Numenorian descent, lived in long-held Numenorian colonies like Belfalas and Pelargir. The nobles of Belfalas were given a hereditary princedom, from which we would eventually get Imrahil, the prince of Dol Amroth. Despite its role as the lesser kingdom, Gondor is, from the very beginning, more powerful and populous than the northern Arnor. Though soon enough, Gondor would have to look north for aid. Shortly after the cities of Minas Anor, Osgiliath, and Minas Ithil are finished, the fires of Orodruin awaken, signaling the return of Sauron. Being survivors of Numenor, the Gondorians were aware of Sauron from his time on the Island Kingdom, though this was their first proof that he had survived the destruction. From this moment onward, the men of Gondor refer to Orodruin as Amon Amar, or Mount Doom. In 3429, Sauron begins his quest for vengeance upon the men of Numenor. He launches an attack upon Minas Ithil, forcing Isildur to retreat along with his family and a seedling of the White Tree of Gondor. He sails down the Anduin and out to sea, before going to his father in Arnor. Meanwhile, Anarion is left to hold out against Sauron, protecting Minas Anor and Osgiliath for the next 5 years. He would in fact succeed in driving Sauron's forces back to the Efel Duath, but as their enemy gathers reinforcements, they know they cannot hold the line indefinitely. Finally, in 3434 of the Second Age, Isildur would return alongside his father, Elrond Half-Elven, and the High King of the Noldor, Gil-galad, in the last alliance of elves and men. Anarion would join this host at the northwest corner of Mordor, where they fight Sauron's forces in the Battle of Dagorlad. While the death toll is great, especially among the Sylvan elves, the Alliance is victorious and presses on to Sauron's own fortress. For the next 7 years, the Alliance lays siege to Barad-dûr. In the 6th year of the siege, Anarion is struck by a rock thrown from the tower and killed. Finally, in 3441, Sauron himself comes forth from Barad-dûr. So great was his attack that he pushes the Alliance back to the slopes of Mount Doom. But there, Sauron comes face to face with the High Kings of elves and men, Gil-galad and Elendil. The three fight in legendary combat until all three are thrown down. In this moment, Isildur takes the hilt shard of his father's sword and cuts the One Ring from Sauron's hand. No longer able to hold his physical form, Sauron's spirit flees, and the Alliance is victorious. Isildur returns to Gondor after the leveling of Barad-dûr and the destruction of Sauron's forces. With his father and brother both slain in the war, he is now in line to become the new High King. At the border of Anorion and Calenarthon, Isildur constructs a secret tomb for Elendil upon Amon Anwar. He would also plant the seedling of the White Tree in Minas Anor in memory of his brother. And after 2 years of preparing his nephew Meneldyl for rule, he leaves Gondor in the hands of its third king. Isildur departs Gondor in the 2nd year of the Third Age, intending to take up the High Kingship of both Gondor and Arnor in Annúminas. Instead, he would die after an ambush by orcs, and the One Ring is lost to the Anduin. Despite the loss of Isildur, both Gondor and Arnor would grow in wealth and power for the next 800 years. Gondor's growth would only briefly be interrupted by an Easterling invasion in 492 of the Third Age. And while Arnor would eventually begin its steady decline into ruin, Gondor would continue marching to prosperity. From 830 to 1149, Gondor experiences its Golden Age, a period of rule by 4 consecutive rulers, collectively known as the Ship Kings. These kings, Taranon Falastur, Eärnil I, Kiriandil, and Kirjaher, would seek to expand Gondor's might in both military and navy. Taranon, the first of these kings, extends Gondor's realm both west and south of the mountains of Anduin. Taranon Taranon is also known as the husband of Queen Baruthia, a black Numenorian known for being nefarious, solitary, and loveless, and of course, for her spy cats, all of which is covered in my Black Numenorians video. Taranon is the first king of Gondor to die without an heir to his throne, and having years earlier cast his wife out to sea adrift aboard a ship, the crown passes to his nephew, Eärnil I. Eärnil continues the expansion of his uncle by constructing a great navy and repairing the old Numenorian port of Pelargir. Despite the greatness Gondor had achieved, it was not yet the supreme power of the coasts of Middle-earth, for there was still the haven of Umbar, also a former Numenorian region, but under the control of Black Numenorians and Haradrim. In 933 of the Third Age, 20 years into his kingship, Eärnil attacks the forces of Umbar, seizing control of the harbor and as a result, the seas of Middle-earth. Still, the sea itself was not tamed, for just 3 years later, Eärnil is lost at sea and never seen again. His son, Kiriandil, rises to the kingship. This third ship king continues the practice of building ever more ships, though he would die 79 years later in Umbar, when the Haradrim, led by the lords exiled by his father, lay siege to the city. Kiriahir then becomes the fourth and final ship king. He seeks vengeance for his father's death, and after building up his armies, he attacks Harad by both land and sea in a decisive victory in 1050. He forces the defeated kings of Harad to acknowledge the overlordship of Gondor, and dubs himself Hyarmendasil, meaning South Victor. At this moment, Gondor is at the very height of its power, both militarily and in terms of lands occupied. Their lands stretched from Celebrant in the north to Harnen and Umbar in the south, from the Grey Flood in the west to the Sea of Rhûn in the east. The realm was now spread far and wide, but it would not last, for lesser kings, plague, and civil war were on the horizon. With Hyarmendasil's death in 1149, his son Atanatar takes the throne as the 16th king of Gondor. During his 77-year reign, the strength and wealth of Gondor would begin to deteriorate. The 19th king was Romendasil II, who would take the crown in 1304. And while there had been 2 kings between these rulers, Romendasil was effectively the ruler during nearly the entire reigns of his father and uncle before him, after winning great renown in battle. During the rule of his uncle, the Easterlings resumed their attacks on Gondor, and during his battles, Romendasil discovers that not all the Northmen adhered to Gondor. Seeking to secure the region, he leads a great force from Gondor to attack the Easterling army, occupying the lands between Rovanion and the Sea of Rhûn in 1248. His attack is a success, completely defeating the Easterlings west of the sea. It is then that he begins going by the name Romendasil, meaning East Victor. In that very year, Romendasil fortifies the western shore of the Anduin north through the lands of Calenarthon. It is at his behest that the Argonath, the great pillars of the kings Anarion and Isildur, are constructed north of Amon Hen. It's possible that the Seat of Seeing and the Seat of Hearing were also built during this time, given their proximity and Romendasil's interest in the north. He also took a special interest in the Northmen, many of whom he brought into his service. Romendasil even goes so far as to send his son to live among the Northmen, though this seemingly small act would bring civil war to Gondor. Prince Valakar would marry a woman of the Northmen and have a son named Eldakar. Valakar would rule for 66 years after his father's death, but when he dies in 1432, Eldakar takes the throne to the anger of many. For many Gondorians of Numenorian blood disapproved of Eldakar's mixed heritage and believed a half-breed had no right to rule. Chief among these was his second cousin, Castamir. Castamir was Gondor's captain of ships, and thus was supported by both Umbar and Pelargir, among other coastal regions of the realm. In 1437, 5 years into his cousin's rule, Castamir leads a rebellion and besieges the city of Osgiliath. During this attack,
item is
Osgiliath
complete.
is covered in flames,
Defense
and the
upgrade
Dome of
complete.
Stars, a great hall in the capital, is destroyed, and its palantir is lost in the Anduin. In his sack of Osgiliath, Castamir first shows his utter cruelty and executes Eldakar's son, Ornendil. Thus begins the kin strife in Gondor, a topic that can and will get its own video in the future. But for now, we'll touch on some of the biggest key points. Eldakar goes into exile, fleeing to his mother's kin in Rovania. In turn, many of the Northmen previously loyal to Gondor, as well as Gondorians in the northern provinces, rally behind the rightful king. Castamir would rule Gondor for 10 years, continuing to show his true colors to his people, and steadily losing favor and becoming seen as the usurper he was. Finally, in 1447, Eldakar returns with a great army from Rovanion and meets Castamir's forces at the crossings of Erui. Many are killed in this deadly conflict before Eldakar takes his vengeance upon Castamir, killing him in single combat. Castamir's sons retreat to the haven of Pelargir, where they would hold out for a year before sailing with all their forces to Umbar. Eldakar, who had no ships of his own, is unable to pursue them, and as a result, Gondor would lose control of Umbar for the next 400 years, as the sons of Castamir join the enemies of Gondor, bringing into existence the Corsairs of Umbar. The Corsairs would ally with the Haradrim in a war against Gondor, in which the new king, Eldakar's son Aldamir, was killed. 11 years later, in 1551, Aldamir's son would defeat the men of Harad in battle, avenging his father and taking the name Hyar Mendesil II. The Corsairs would plague the coast of Gondor for many years, but another plague would become a much greater concern for Gondor in 1636. This plague affects a huge area of Middle-earth, and its source is an old and ancient foe. The plague coincides with the emergence of a shadow in Dol Guldur, and Sauron's plague would not only devastate Gondor, but their enemies to the east and south as well. We are told Osgiliath is especially hard hit, and people fleeing the city would cause Minas Anor to become the new capital of the kingdom. Meanwhile, Kalinarthon is so hard hit by the plague that it is nearly completely abandoned. Among the casualties of this plague are not only thousands of Gondorians, but King Telemnar, all his children, and even the White Tree of Gondor. After the kin strife and now this great plague, Gondor has been severely weakened. In 1856 of the Third Age, enemies would once again come from the east. The spirit of Sauron once again moves the Easterlings into hostilities against Gondor. This group of Easterlings, known as the Wain Riders, traveled in great fortified camps of wagons and had invaded Rovanion. King Narmasil II leads Gondor and the men of the north in the Battle of the Plains, south of Mirkwood. The battle is a disaster. Narmasil II is killed, and the Easterlings enslave the people of Rovanion. Some of the Northmen would escape and flee to the upper vales of Anduin in their exile, becoming known as the Eotheid. The first lord of the Eotheid warns the new king, Kalimetar, who is determined to avenge his father, that the Wain Riders are preparing a raid on Kalinarthon, but that the enslaved Northmen were also nearing a revolt. With time being precious, Kalimetar leads an army north, drawing the Wain Riders south to meet them at Dagorlad. As the battle seems in doubt, Kalimetar's secret cavalry crosses the Undeeps, meets up with the Eotheid riders, and arriving at the battle, assure their victory. Between the battle and the revolt in Rovanion, the Wain Riders are driven back to the east. In 1940 of the Third Age, after many centuries of operating independently of one another, King Ondohair of Gondor meets with King Arafant of Arthedain, a splinter kingdom of the former Arnor. They realize that the wars and plagues and misfortune they've experienced are no mere coincidence. There is a single force, bent upon the destruction of the Dunedain. The kingdoms ally once more, in hopes of saving both from collapse, and Prince Arvedui marries Ondoher's daughter Firiel, further cementing their alliance. However, whatever alliance there was would be short-lived, and merely bring about another contest for the throne. Just 4 years after their alliance, Gondor's enemies make a coordinated assault. The Haradrim invade from the south, and just a few days later, Wainriders return from the east. Ondoher's distant cousin, Eärnil II, leads an army south, while Ondoher leads an army north to meet the Wainriders. The chariots and horsemen of the Easterlings wreak havoc upon the king's guard, and Ondoher and both his sons are killed in the disaster of the Morannon. After destroying the Haradrim in the south, Eärnil II brings his army north, catching the Easterlings by surprise in their celebration, and decimate their forces, driving the survivors back to the east. With the death of Ondoher and his heirs, both Arvedui and Eärnil II lay claim to the throne. Arvedui's claim comes from, and would hinge upon, reintroducing an ancient Númenórean law of accession, which would see the eldest child, not the eldest son, inherit the throne, in which case his wife Firiel would become the first ruling queen of Gondor. He also attempts to capitalize on the fact that he himself was the heir of Isildur, and that their children would symbolize this reunification of Gondor and Arnor. While the steward, Helendur, and the Council of Gondor acknowledge the honor that the heir of Isildur title commands, they decree the king of Gondor must be of the line of Anarion, and the kingship passes to Eärnil II. Eärnil, who is described as both wise and humble, sends a message to Arvedui, saying, "I do not forget the loyalty of Arnor, nor deny our kinship, nor wish that the realms of Elendil should be estranged. I will send you aid when you have need, so far as I am able." This oath would be fulfilled as Arthedain continues to be plagued by its centuries-old enemy, the Witch King of Angmar. In the fall of 1973, Gondor receives word that Arthedain is about to be attacked as the Angmar War surpasses 400 years. Eärnil II sends his son, Eärnor, north, with a fleet as great as they could spare. However, by the time they arrive, Arthedain is conquered, and Arvedui is drowned in the sea. Eärnur joins with Círdan, and the combined force of elves and men destroys the army of Angmar. Eärnur seeks to fight the Witch King, but his horse is terrified and flees the battle against its rider's wishes. The Witch King mocks him, but would himself flee at the coming of Glorfindel and the elves of Rivendell. It was in this moment that Glorfindel pronounced his prophecy, that not by the hand of man shall he fall. Being driven from the north, the Witch King would instead bring the war directly to Gondor. He returns to Mordor in 1980 and rallies the other 8 Nazgûl to him. 20 years later, they lay siege to Minas Ithil, and in 2002 of the Third Age, they sack the city and take control of its Palantir, and remake the city to a place of unspeakable evil. This once great city of Isildur is occupied by foul creatures, and comes to be known as Minas Morgul, Tower of Dark Sorcery. This leads many Gondorians living in Ithilien to flee, depopulating the lands east of the river. After his father's death, Eärnur ascends to the throne in 2043. After his coronation, the Witch King sends him a challenge to single combat, while reminding him of his disgrace of seeming to flee the battlefield in the north. Fortunately, the steward, Mardil Voronwe, convinces the king not to go. However, 7 years later, in 2050, the Witch King renews his challenge, and this time, the king would accept. He sets his crown upon his father's lap in the Houses of the Dead, and with a small escort of knights, he rides across the river and past the gates of Minas Morgul. None of the company would ever be seen again. Eärnur dies with no heir, and there are likewise no others to claim the throne. Thus ends the male line of Anarion. The rule of Gondor passes to the stewards, who were set to
Spit
rule
it out.
until the king
The item is
returns.
complete.
For no one knew whether or not Earnur had indeed been killed. Whatever other claims to the kingship would go unclaimed, either out of doubt or out of fear of another kinstrife. The era of the ruling stewards would last for nearly 1,000 years, a time that would see the return of the Easterlings and Corsairs, old allies made into a new kingdom, visits from the Astari, and a war of the Ring. We'll cover all that and much more in the History of Gondor Part 2, here on Nerd of the Rings. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Listen Me the Cinda, Kella Brimbor, The Mighty Mim, Team Weasel, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, Toby Mob's Music, CCDC Red Team, Nerd Sidgeman Anytimer, Pelkey Sports Cards, Moki the Brown, Christopher Carbaugh, Joe Tepper, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Salim Rahman, Zetrock, Berto Berg, Grand Strategy Nerd, Graham Darracott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, Grant McGregor, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings. The line of kings is ended. The Witch King has killed the last king of Gondor, and the time of the ruling stewards has begun. Over the next 1,000 years, they would lead Gondor through further war, but also alliances with other men and a wizard. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we continue the history of Gondor. After the childless King Earnur is killed by the Witch King in Minas Morgul, it is believed the line of Anarion has failed. No one with any tangential claim to the throne would come forward, for no one wanted to risk another kinstrife. At this time, Gondor is far from its previous heights, and another kinstrife would likely have destroyed the realm entirely. Thus, the rule of Gondor passes to the line of the stewards. Mardil Voronwe, the steward who attempted to dissuade Earnur from marching to face the Witch King, becomes the first of these ruling stewards in 2050 of the Third Age. As explained in last week's video, the stewards were said to rule until the king returns, for they had no proof that Earnur was indeed dead. Out of respect for the king's position, the stewards would never sit on the throne of Gondor, but in their chair of black stone placed below it. They would also never wear a crown, but simply hold a white rod, a symbol of their position. Upon being sworn in, each steward pledged to hold rod and rule in the name of the king until he shall return. While certainly respected, it is not believed the latter portion of this pledge will ever come to fruition. There were none in Gondor descended from Isildur's direct line, and by this time the northern realm of Arnor was wiped out, the sole remnant being the relatively small group of Dunedain Rangers. The rule of the stewards would actually begin rather well. Mardil is said to have ruled with a steady hand, which is how he earns the moniker Voronwe, meaning the steadfast. And fortunately for his descendants, their rule would coincide with the period of time known as the Watchful Peace. During Mardil's rule, in 2063 of the Third Age, the wizard Gandalf the Grey went to Dol Guldur to investigate the shadow growing there. Not ready to reveal himself, this necromancer flees, and for nearly 400 years, Gondor and much of Middle-earth would have peace. While Sauron goes to the east, where he would work to corrupt the men of that land, his Nazgul look inward. Rather than plan attacks, they would instead prepare for Sauron's return, giving Gondor a respite from war. However, Gondor would use this opportunity to strengthen its borders with Mordor and Minas Morgul. Hador, the seventh ruling steward, is recorded as the last of his line to have a lifespan of a Dunedain, living to 150 years. At this point, the blood of Numenor waned, and the lifespan of the stewards would shorten closer to that of normal men. The Watchful Peace comes to an end in 2460 of the Third Age, during the rule of Denethor I, not to be confused with Denethor II, who we'll meet nearly 500 years
Commerce
later.
upgrade complete.
15 years after Sauron returns to Dol Guldur, a new menace would be unveiled, the Uruk-hai. Unbeknownst to their enemies, the lords of Minas Morgul had bred this new race of orc. Faster, larger, stronger, and smarter than typical orcs. The Uruk-hai could travel in daylight without being weakened. They are unleashed from Mordor and conquer the lands of Ithilien and sack the city of Osgiliath. Denethor's son, Boromir, leads the Gondorian forces in driving Uruks out of Osgiliath, reclaiming the once great capital. However, this would be the final blow to the city. Already damaged and depopulated starting with the earlier Kinstrife, Osgiliath is completely abandoned after the attack by the Uruk-hai. Boromir would succeed his father as steward in 2477 of the Third Age, and while he had previously won back Osgiliath, the steward would have to fight several campaigns to win back the lands of Ithilien from the orcs. While he would eventually win back the lands of Gondor, Ithilien would remain depopulated, and during the war he receives a mortal wound. Despite his strength, which was great, Boromir would become shrunken with pain and die just 12 years into his rule. The rule of Gondor passes to Boromir's son, Cirion, who would become one of the realm's most famous stewards. He takes leadership of a kingdom where the corsairs of Umbar have begun raiding the coasts once more. Ithilien, the land bordering its closest enemy, is deserted, and their northern province of Calinarthon is almost completely depopulated. Between Calinarthon and the forts along the Anduin having been long abandoned, Cirion's primary concern is invasion from the north. He sends out spies so that he may be informed of any coming threats, and his men return with dire news. A new group of Easterlings has emerged, the Balkoth. Likely descended from the Wainriders, the Balkoth were under the shadow of Dol Guldur, and using a large number of wagons, they were making their way westward. In the spring of 2509, Cirion receives word that hosts of these men are mustering along the southern border of Mirkwood, preparing to invade Gondor. Desperate for aid, Cirion sends out 6 volunteer riders to seek out their old allies, the Eotheid, from the far north. Of the 6 riders, only one would survive the 950-mile journey. Morondir delivers the Red Arrow, a symbol of the dire circumstances and a call for aid, to King Eorl the Young. Knowing the chances of word reaching the Eotheid were slim, and not knowing how they would respond, Cirion musters as great a force as he is able. He personally leads the army north to meet this new foe. However, the Balkoth cross the river Anduin and overpower the Gondorians, driving them north over the Limelight River. A bad situation gets worse as orcs descend from the Misty Mountains, pinning Cirion against the Anduin. In this moment when hope was lost, there was a sudden sounding of horns. The riders of Eorl had come. The Eotheid turned the tide of battle, driving the enemies away and pursuing the Balkoth across the fields of Calinarthon. 3 months later, Eorl comes to the Mering Stream at the request of Cirion. Since the Battle of the Field of Celebrant, Cirion had cleared the path to Amon Anwar. Cirion offers Eorl all the lands of Calinarthon and for their people to live in perpetual alliance with one another. Eorl accepts, and their 2 parties ascend the hill, where Cirion reveals the secret tomb of Elendil, with his own son Halas, 2 counselors of Gondor, and the Prince of Dol Amroth as witnesses. Cirion pledges his bond with Eorl and his people. In response, Eorl pledges an oath of his own. Hear now all peoples who bow not to the shadow in the east. By the gift of the Lord of the Mundburg, we will come to dwell in the land that he names Calinarthon, and therefore I vow in my own name, and on behalf of the Eotheid of the north, that between us and the great people of the west, there shall be friendship forever. Their enemies shall be our enemies. Their need shall be our need. And whatsoever evil, or threat, or assault may come upon them, we will aid them to the utmost end of our strength. This vow shall descend to my heirs, all such as may come after me in our new land, and let them keep it in faith unbroken, lest the shadow fall upon them, and they become accursed. Kirion then made answer. Standing to his full height, he laid his hand upon the tomb, and in his right hand held up the white wand of the stewards, and spoke words that filled those who heard them with awe. For as he stood up, the sun went down in flame in the west, and his white robe seemed to be on fire. And after he had vowed that Gondor should be bound by a like bond of friendship and aid in all need, he lifted up his voice and said, "This oath shall stand in memory of the glory of the land of the star, and of the faith of Elendil the faithful, in the keeping of those who sit upon the thrones of the west, and of the one who is above all thrones, forever." Invoking the name of Iluvatar himself, such an oath had not been heard in Middle-earth since Elendil himself swore an allegiance with Gil-galad to form the last alliance of elves and men. Thus, Eorl becomes the first ruler of a new kingdom, the kingdom of Rohan, ever after in alliance with the men of Gondor. The names Rohan and Rohirrim being devised by Kirion's son, Halas. With Amon Anwar no longer making the midpoint of Gondor, Kirion removes the tomb of Elendil and has it placed in the Hallows of Rath Dinin in Minas Tirith. The following 200 years would largely be peaceful ones for Gondor. Between 2628 and 2655, during the rule of Be'lakor I, we are told the Corsairs of Umbar once again become a threat to Gondor, though no specific battles or events are recorded. During the rule of Ecthelion I, the Steward has the White Tower rebuilt in Minas Tirith. Standing 300 feet tall, the Great Tower shone like a spike of crystals, pearl, and silver. It would ever after be known as the White Tower of Ecthelion. The oath between Gondor and Rohan would be called upon multiple times over the coming centuries, though it would not always be answered. In 2710 of the Third Age, King Deor of Rohan would request the aid of Steward Elgamoth when Dunlending seized control of the Ring of Isengard. However, this came in a period of renewed war with the orcs, making Gondor unable to answer the call. Elgamoth's son Beren would spend much of his rule fighting the Corsairs of Umbar. During the long winter of 2758 to 2759, Gondor is assailed by 3 great fleets from Umbar and Harad, along the Gondorian coast as far north as the mouth of Isen. The northernmost of these forces joins with the Dunlendings in attacking King Helm Hammerhand's Rohan. Both kingdoms under attack, neither Gondor nor Rohan could assist the other for a long while. However, with spring on the horizon, Beren's son Baragon defeats the invading Corsairs and Haradrim. Thus, Gondor is finally able to send aid to Rohan, fulfilling the oath. Both Gondor and Rohan would survive these attacks, though Rohan's capital of Edoras was under enemy control for much of the winter. In the aftermath, Gondor is visited by one of the Astari. The wizard Saruman comes to Beren and requests permission to dwell in Isengard. Beren gladly agrees to having a wizard ally on the northern border of Rohan, and gives him the key of Orthanc. Saruman by this time had already been seeking his own benefit, having researched much of the Rings of Power, and deducing that one of the Palantiri remained in Orthanc. During the rule of Beren's son, Baragon, Gondor would once again be troubled by orcs. However, these orcs were not from Mordor. Instead, they were orcs fleeing the Battle of Azanabalzar, the climactic fight in the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. They take up residence in the White Mountains, and many battles would occur between men and orcs before the latter are destroyed. Still, Baragon's rule is largely a positive one, as Gondor begins to recover some of its strength. With the blood of Numenor still dwindling in the line of the Stewards, Baragon's son Be'lakor II is the last to live to 100 years old. Upon his death, the White Tree of Gondor also dies. However, the people of Gondor would leave it standing until the king comes. In 2882, Turin II becomes the 23rd ruling steward of Gondor and would do much to secure the future of his realm. Ithilien was further deserted by his people due to invasions of orcs, but Turin II would not forsake these lands. He builds secret refuges for his soldiers in Ithilien so that they could combat this threat. The longest guarded and manned of these outposts was Henneth Anun, the very cave Faramir would take Frodo and Sam over 130 years later. But the greatest threat during Turin II's rule would come from the south. Ever since the Kinstrife, the lands of Horondor, also known as South Gondor, were a debated land between the Corsairs of Umbar and the Kingdom of Gondor. By the time of Turin II, the Haradrim occupied South Gondor, and from there in 2885, they would launch an invasion of Ithilien with great force. Fortunately, King Folkwyne of Rohan would fulfill the Oath of Eorl and sends many Rohirrim to Gondor. Thanks to the assistance of Theoden's great-grandfather, Gondor succeeds in defeating the Haradrim. Still, with this invasion, Gondor completely withdraws its people from Ithilien. The only ones remaining in the realm are the Rangers of Ithilien, soldiers left to harass the forces of their enemy as they could. Around 2900 of the Third Age, Turin II would also refortify the river island of Caer Andros to protect Gondor from the north. The rule of Turin's son Turgon would be largely peaceful, but for one notable occurrence. In 2951, 10 years after being driven from Dol Guldur by the White Council, Sauron declares himself openly in Mordor and begins rebuilding Barad-dûr. Just 2 years later, Turgon's son Ecthelion II becomes the 25th ruling steward of Gondor. Ecthelion II is known for his wisdom and used all his power to strengthen Gondor in the face of a resurgent Sauron. He would strengthen both the haven of Pelargir and Caer Andros. He would encourage worthy men from both within Gondor and without to enter into his service in exchange for ranks and reward. One stranger who comes into the steward's service is a man named Thorongil, who had previously served King Thingol of Rohan. Ecthelion grew to love Thorongil above all others, possibly even his own son, Denethor II. Denethor grows bitter toward Thorongil, and much of their council was in opposition. Thorongil advised Ecthelion to not trust Saruman and Isengard, but to instead turn to Gandalf the Grey. Thorongil advises the steward that the Corsairs of Umbar, the long-held enemies of Gondor, would prove a great threat to the southern fiefdoms if Sauron were to turn to open war. Ecthelion permits Thorongil to launch a surprise attack on the haven of Umbar, which severely damages the Corsair fleet. Thorongil could have then returned to Minas Tirith with great honor, but instead sends a farewell message to Ecthelion, for other tasks now called him. For Thorongil would indeed return to Minas Tirith nearly 40 years later, as this descendant of both Isildur and Anarion would return under his rightful name, Aragorn, son of Arathorn. For the final stage in Gondor's history, which we will cover next week, will be defined by the rules of Denethor and Aragorn, the War of the Ring, and the dawn of the Fourth Age. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Listen Me the Cinda, Celeburnbor, The Mighty Mim, Team Weasel, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, Toby Mom's Music, CCDC Red Team, Nerd Sidgman Anytimer, Pelkey Sports Cards, Moki the Brown, Christopher Carbaugh, Joe Tepper, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Salim Rahman, Zetrock, Berto Berg, Grand Strategy Nerd, Graham Darracott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, Grant McGregor, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.
We are ready. The item is complete.
Despite hundreds of years of war, plague, and strife, the South Kingdom of Men has endured for over 3,000 years. But as the reign of its 26th steward approaches, so does the greatest challenge to its very survival, the War of the Ring. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we conclude the history of Gondor. As we discussed in last week's video, Aragorn, under the name Thorongil, had successfully led a campaign to attack
Production
and
of the
weaken the
item is
Corsairs of
complete.
Umbar in 2980 of the Third Age. However,
last,
rather than return to
planet item
Gondor,
ready.
other duties called him, and he makes his way to the east. One who is not sorry to see this Thorongil disappear is Denethor II, who takes his role as 26th ruling steward just 4 years later in 2984. Denethor and his wife
Military structure
Finduilas,
complete.
the sister of Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, had 2 sons, Boromir and Faramir.
Military structure
Boromir is
complete.
doted upon by his father and is interested in great deeds of battle. Faramir, meanwhile, displeased his father in both his actions
Defense
and his
upgrade
friendship
complete.
with Gandalf the Grey. While not as highly regarded by his people as
Exotics have been
Thorongil had been,
unveiled by our
Denethor
squires.
proves to be a more than capable ruler. He is quiet, listens to counsel, and is wise in his rule. However, just 4 years after rising to the role of steward, his wife
Production of the
Finduilas
item is
becomes one of
complete.
many to fall under the shadow of Mordor and
The item
dies
is
at just
complete.
38 years old. Overcome with grief, Denethor becomes even more grim and silent. Also weighing on the steward is the continuing resurgence of
Civilian structure
Sauron.
complete.
Denethor anticipates that it will be during his time that Sauron will make his great war upon Middle-earth. Despite its dwindling power over long centuries, Gondor is unquestionably the strongest of all the remaining realms that oppose Sauron. This makes the conquest of Gondor Sauron's primary objective in the coming war. The weight of these events, combined with overconfidence in his own willpower, leads Denethor to gaze into the long-forbidden Minas Anor Palantir to seek knowledge. Indeed, Denethor would be successful in gaining the knowledge he sought, so much so that we are told his people wondered at him. However, Sauron, who would use his captured Ithil Stone, discovers Denethor was also using one of the Palantiri. Sauron attempts to bring the Anor Stone under his will, like he had done with Saruman and the Orthanc Stone. However, he is unsuccessful. Denethor's strength of will, integrity, and right to use the stone wins out over even Sauron himself, though it comes at a cost. Denethor's already weakening body is given an even greater toll due to the stress of using the stone, and Sauron's apparent invincibility he sees in the Palantir. This causes the steward to age prematurely. Sauron would finally launch the first attack of the War of the Ring on June 20th, 3018. While in outward appearance this attack on Osgiliath was made to test Denethor's strength, it also had the secret task of allowing the Nazgul to pass into Gondor undetected. To Sauron's dismay, Gondor is stronger than he believed. Boromir and Faramir defended, then destroyed the ancient bridge of Osgiliath, denying Sauron's forces access to the western side of the river. The night before the attack, the brothers had a prophetic dream, speaking of a halfling, a blade that was broken, and the land of Imladris. Denethor recognizes Imladris to be Rivendell and sends Boromir on the errand to find it, an errand from which he will never return. As Boromir heads north and joins the Fellowship of the Ring, Faramir is sent on March 1st to lead the Rangers of Ithilien. These lands that were so long a part of Gondor were now essentially held by the enemy. Operating out of places like Heneth Anun, the Rangers would raid the servants of Sauron, like the Haradrim, as often as they could. On the day Boromir is killed at Amon Hen, both Faramir and Denethor hear the horn of Gondor in the distance. 3 nights later, Faramir is sitting by the banks of the Anduin in Osgiliath, when he either sees or envisions a boat carrying his brother's body out to sea. 13 days after Boromir's death, on March 9th, Gandalf and Pippin arrive in Minas Tirith. On their way, they had seen another great feature of Gondor, the warning beacons. The beacons had been in place since the late Second Age, and were used to warn the southern lands of danger in Calenarthon. With Calenarthon now Rohan, they are typically used to warn the people of Anorion of danger. That very day, the Red Arrow is delivered to King Theoden, a summons for aid from Denethor. and on March 10th, Sauron sends fumes from Mordor, blocking out the sun in much of Gondor and Rohan in what is known as the Dawnless Day. That very day, the Dark Lord sends his host from Minas Morgul under the command of Gondor's old nemesis, the Witch King of Angmar. Also on March 10th, Faramir retreats across the Pelennor Fields and is saved from the Nazgul by Gandalf the White. In preparation for an assault on Minas Tirith, most citizens of Gondor are sent to flee north and west. Those remaining behind are soldiers, healers, and boys who refuse to leave. In order to reinforce the capital, 3,000 men from the southern fiefs, including Belfalas and Dol Amroth, come to Minas Tirith. We are told these 3,000 soldiers are less than a tenth of what was needed. For while the Witch King marches closer to Minas Tirith, many in the south are preoccupied with fighting the Black Fleet of Umbar. Denethor sends Faramir to Osgiliath to intercept the Witch King's army on March 11th. The following morning, Sauron's host uses secret boats to cross the river and overwhelm the Gondorians, causing Faramir to retreat to the Causeway Forts on March 13th. Learning the Witch King was on the field of battle, Gandalf makes for the Ramas Ekor, where Faramir had retreated to. Thanks to a charge by his uncle Prince Imrahil, Faramir, wounded and suffering under the black breath of the Nazgul, is saved and brought back to Minas Tirith. As the Pelennor is overrun by Sauron's forces, Denethor is overcome with grief at his son's state. He loses his will to fight and gives no more thought to the defense of his city. Gandalf and Imrahil must take up command of Minas Tirith as the siege of Gondor begins. Throughout the day of March 14th, the hosts of Mordor dig pits and build siege weapons on the Pelennor. The Nazgul continue flying over the city, bringing despair to the soldiers awaiting the battle. The orcs launch stones into the city which burst into flame, followed by catapulting the severed heads of slain Gondorians over the city walls. And with the morale of the Gondorians at its lowest point, the Witch King begins his assault around midnight. The might of the Wall of Gondor and the steadfastness of many of their people held out for a time against the invaders. However, the Great Gate of Minas Tirith is broken by the battering ram, Grond. In rides the Lord of the Nazgul, and there is only one who stands in defiance of him, Gandalf the White upon Shadowfax. And unlike Eärnur's steed so long ago, Shadowfax would not flee the Witch King. Just as the Witch King draws his blade, which erupts with flames, horns begin to blow in the distance. Rohan had come. Thus, the morning of March 15th brings the climax of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, the largest and greatest of the War of the Ring. Theoden's Rohirrim strike a mighty blow to the forces of Mordor. He personally kills the chieftain of the Haradrim before being struck down by the Witch King himself. The Witch King in turn is killed by Merry and Éowyn. While this loss is hugely demoralizing for Sauron's army, Gothmog, lieutenant of Minas Morgul, assumes command, and the Southrons charge with their Mumakil. Éomer, having discovered his sister seemingly dead upon the battlefield, flies into a rage, fully prepared to die as Rohan's final leader. Another prepared to die as the final ruler of his people is Denethor, though under very different circumstances. Denethor prepares a funeral pyre for him and Faramir to burn. While Gandalf and Pippin would save Faramir, Denethor lights himself ablaze. One reason for Denethor's despair was a vision Éomer would see come to fruition. Denethor had seen a fleet of enemy ships with black sails arriving at the Ramas, prepared to enter the fight. Éomer beholds this development and believes the final stroke has come, and the Rohirrim and Gondorians will soon be destroyed. However, it was not their enemy in these ships, for Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, the sons of Elrond, and the Grey Company had walked the paths of the dead, and the dead men had driven the Haradrim and Corsairs from the Gondorian settlements and havens. Aragorn then commandeered the Black Ships, bringing many reinforcements from the southern fiefdoms, who had flocked to the banner of the heir of Isildur. Rather than Éomer being caught against overwhelming odds, the host of Mordor is now caught between hammer and anvil, and the Battle of the Pelennor Fields is a victory for Gondor and Rohan, the Oath of Eorl, once again fulfilled. After the victory, Aragorn furls his banner and makes camp outside the city. He appoints Imrahil the temporary lord of the city as per Gondorian law. Aragorn would later enter the city in secret, coming to the Houses of Healing, where he healed Merry, Éowyn, and Faramir, all of whom were suffering under the Black Breath. Greater than any genealogy was this fulfillment of a prophecy. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and so shall the rightful king be known. Word spread throughout the city, and Aragorn would work late into the night healing the citizens of Gondor. After taking counsel with Gandalf, Éomer, Imrahil, Elladan, and Elrohir, Aragorn resolves to lead a force in a distractionary attack upon Mordor, in hopes it would give Frodo a chance to destroy the One Ring. This force of 7,000 leaves Minas Tirith on March 18th. It is estimated that a defensive force of around 9,000 is left to protect the city, featuring Rohirrim, soldiers from the southern fiefdoms, and survivors of the city. The host of the West would meet an army of Sauron's orcs, trolls, Haradrim, and Easterlings, numbering over 60,000. The Great Eagles would of course also come to the battle and aid the men, and the One Ring is indeed destroyed, causing the destruction of Sauron, the Nazgul, Barad-dûr, the Black Gate, and most of Sauron's forces. With the great enemy permanently disembodied and never again a threat, Aragorn returns to Minas Tirith, where Faramir, now steward of Gondor, leads the ceremony crowning Aragorn King of Gondor and Arnor. Aragorn reinstates the role of Steward of Gondor as it had once been before the line of kings failed, and makes Faramir both Steward of Gondor and Prince of Ithilien. In time, Ithilien would indeed become populated once more. One group who came to dwell there are some elves of Mirkwood, led by Legolas, and it is said Ithilien once again became the fairest country in all the Westlands. As for Aragorn, he would be taken up the slopes of Mount Mindolluin behind Minas Tirith by Gandalf, and there would find a sapling of the White Tree of Gondor, planting it in place of the Long Dead Tree, which is taken to the Houses of the Dead. After her arrival with her father, grandmother, and grandfather, Arwen marries Aragorn in Minas Tirith on Midsummer's Day, 3019. Now king of the reunited kingdom of Gondor and Arnor, Aragorn sets to reordering his realm. He orders the restoration of Orthanc, and has the Palantir returned there. He declares the Druadan Forest a protected realm of his kingdom belonging to the Druidine. The Shire is likewise declared a free land under the protection of his kingdom, and he forbids men from entering it without the leave of the Halflings. He also expands the Shire to include the lands as far west as Emin Bereid. Together, Aragorn and Éomer renew the oaths of Cirion and Eorl, and due to the effects of Sauron's influence, we are told Éomer would often fulfill the oath, for there were many enemies to defeat before the White Tree could grow in peace. Together, Aragorn and Éomer would ride to both the east and south of Middle-earth, fighting and defeating the last remnants of those loyal to Sauron. We are told specifically Aragorn makes peace with the Haradrim after his coronation, and that the threat of the Corsairs was finally subdued during his reign, and the haven of Umbar finally retaken. The reign of King Aragorn II Elessar would bring prosperity not seen in Gondor for centuries. He would rule for 122 years, before his death on March 1st, 120 of the Fourth Age. At this time, his son Eldarion would take the throne, inheriting a reunited kingdom unburdened by the threat of Sauron, or great enemies influenced by his presence. He is left to lead Gondor further into the new Fourth Age of Middle-earth. While we don't know much canonically of Eldarion's reign, the waning of his rule serves as the backdrop for Tolkien's abandoned sequel. To learn about that story, check out my video on The New Shadow. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom de Bombadil 19, Listen Me the Cinda, Kella Brimbor, The Mighty Mim, Team Weasel, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, Toby Mob's Music, CCDC Red Team, Nerd Situ Anytimer, Pelkey Sports Cards, Mookie the Brown, Christopher Carbaugh, Joe Tepper, Sky Carcass, Slidebelt, Dane Ragnarsson, Salim Rahman, Zetrock, Berto Berg, Grand Strategy Nerd, Graham Darracott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, Grant McGregor, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.
Military structure complete.
He is the 18th king of Rohan, a
Military
man
structure
whose
complete.
youth would be defined by loss and unwavering loyalty, a man whose reign would be defined by friendship and love
Military structure
between his
complete.
realm and Gondor.
Civilian
Today
structure
on Nerd of the
complete.
Rings, we cover the life of Éomer. Éomer is born in 2991 of the Third Age, to his father, Éomund, and mother, Theodwyn, the sister of King Theoden. It is likely that Éomer was born in the city of Aldburg, in the
Logistics
Fold
upgrade
region
complete.
of Rohan. This is where his father was stationed as First Marshal of the Rittermark, the highest military rank in Rohan, tasked with commanding the muster of the Rohirrim. When Éomer is 4 years old, Éomund and Theodwyn have a daughter, Éowyn. Yet it was in these early years of their lives that the Shadow of Mordor reached out to Rohan. Orcs began raiding the eastern regions, slaying and stealing horses from Rohan. Meanwhile, other orcs would come down from the Misty Mountains. Many of these were Uruks in the service of Saruman, though nobody suspected this at the time. Being a great lover of horses and hater of orcs, it is said Éomund would receive news of a raid and would ride against the orcs in hot anger, unwarily, and with few men. One day, in 3002, Éomund pursues a small band of orcs to the borders of the Emyn Muil. Sadly, there was a stronger force lying in wait among the rocks, and ambushing the Rohirrim, they kill Éomund. Not long after this, his wife Theodwyn falls ill and dies.
Civilian structure
A grieving
complete.
Theoden, himself a widower, takes Éomer, now 11, and Éowyn, now 7, into his own house, calling them son and daughter alongside his own son, Theodred, who was then 24 years old. Éomer and his sister would grow up in Edoras, and he would grow to be a tall, strong, and valiant warrior. Hammond and Skull's Reader's Companion to The Lord of the Rings puts Éomer at around 6 feet 6 inches tall. As his father before him, Éomer serves as Marshal of the Rittermark, though he would hold the title of Third Marshal. Theoden himself would serve as First Marshal, with his son Theodred acting as Second Marshal. Unfortunately, Éomer and his cousin would face greater threats than orc raids during their days. The king's advisor, Grima Wormtongue, would ally in
Civilian
secret
structure
with
complete.
Saruman. Through his words and poison, Grima works to undermine Theodred and Éomer and weaken the king. Despite Wormtongue having some measure of success in turning Theoden against Éomer, Éomer's loyalty would never waver. Wormtongue would also seek to turn Theodred and Éomer against one another, an effort that would fail, for they regarded one another as brothers. One day in the summer of 3018,
Civilian
Boromir
structure
of
complete.
Gondor passed through Rohan, on his way north seeking Rivendell. Éomer and the Rohirrim would lend Boromir a horse to use on his journey, though the steed would come back riderless, and they would have no word of
Military
Boromir
structure
until the
complete.
following year.
Exotics
A
have been
few months
unveiled by
after
our
Boromir's
scholars.
travels through their lands, Saruman's orcs, wargs, and Dunlendings would openly make war upon Rohan. The White Wizard claims lordship over their lands and makes the Gap of Rohan impassable. Knowing that Theodred and Eomer are the chief foils to his plans, Saruman launches an attack upon the Rohirrim in the Battle of the Fords of Isen on February 25th, 3019. To his Uruk-hai, he gives a single order: kill the king's son at all costs. Tragically,
Logistics upgrade
Theodred would
complete.
fall in the battle at the age of 41. The following day, Eomer receives word of a company of orcs entering Rohan from the
Military
Emin
structure
Muil,
complete.
the very location of
Production
his
of
father's
the item
death.
is complete.
Believing this to be a sign of an alliance between Sauron and Saruman, Eomer wishes to hunt down this orc force. However, at the behest of Grima, Theoden would forbid his nephew from moving against the orcs, saying that it would leave Edoras unguarded.
Our time has
However, Eomer, suspecting Grima to be a
Unleash
traitor,
our wrath.
leaves around midnight of February 27th
The
with his
fleet
division.
embraces new
Near the end of
vessels.
February 28th,
The
they
Unity
spot
calls
the
us
orcs
to
near the
action.
borders of Fangorn Forest. They would remain watchful of the orcs from a distance.
We
Another
are
group of
ready.
orcs from Isengard, under their leader Mahur, makes their way from the west,
Whatever
seeking the
Unity
group who,
wills.
unbeknownst to the
Military
Rohirrim,
structure
has two
complete.
captive hobbits with them.
Civilian structure
This
complete.
second company is
We
defeated
are
by the
ready.
Rohirrim, and the next
Whatever
morning
Unity
Eomer
wills.
leads his riders in attacking the first. Eomer and his company utterly
Logistics
destroy
upgrade
the
complete.
orcs, and
Military
Eomer
structure
himself
complete.
kills Ugluk,
Production of the
their
item
cruel
is
leader.
complete.
In the battle, Eomer loses 15 of his men and 12 of their horses. The deceased Rohirrim would be buried in a mound, around which the men would place 15 spears, one for each
Civilian
of the
structure
fallen.
complete.
As for the
We
Uruks,
are ready.
the Rohirrim would pile their
Whatever
corpses
the
upon the
Unity
battlefield
wills.
and burn them.
Hostility research
Unbeknownst to
complete.
Eomer, their
We
attack
await your
allowed Merry
command.
and Pippin to escape their captivity, fleeing into
We
Fangorn
are
Forest.
ready.
With their enemies
Whatever the
destroyed,
Unity wills.
Eomer leads his people
We
back
are
toward
ready.
Edoras. However, they would come across a most unexpected trio: a man, an elf, and a dwarf
Military
traveling
structure
through their
complete.
lands. In their
Civilian
ensuing
structure
conversation,
complete.
he would discover that they had been through Lorien. Then there is a lady in the Golden Wood, as old tales tell, he said. Few escape her nets, they say. These are strange days. But if you have her favor, then you also
Production
are
of the
net
item
weavers
is
and sorcerers,
complete.
maybe. Gimli,
Military
who
structure
isn't one to
complete.
tolerate insults toward
Revenge
Lady Galadriel,
awaits.
rises and
We
plants his
obey
feet firmly
Unity's
apart,
will.
hand gripped upon the handle of his axe, and his dark eyes flash.
Logistics
He
upgrade
demands
complete.
Eomer's name and threatens to give him more than his
Military
own in
structure
return.
complete.
While a fight nearly breaks out, Aragorn intervenes, revealing his true name and showing Eomer the sword reforged.
Military
Aragorn goes
structure
on to tell
complete.
of their remarkable journey pursuing the orcs carrying Merry and Pippin, covering some 135 miles in less than 4 full days. In amazement, Eomer declares that rather than Strider,
We tire of
Aragorn
your
should be
insolence.
called
Prepare for
Wingfoot.
judgment.
Eomer reveals all that transpired between the Rohirrim and the orcs, saying there was little hope to
Military
find their
structure
halflings
complete.
alive. The Marshal of the Mark wishes the trio
Our
to
forces
accompany
have
him back to
engaged the
Edoras and aid Rohan in their time of need. Yet Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli would insist on searching for the hobbits. Eomer would give to the 3 companions 2 horses whose riders had died in the battle with the Uruks, Hasufel and Arold. He only asked that they be returned to Edoras when they had finished their search. With this, Eomer and his riders resumed their ride back to Edoras. Upon their return, Eomer is confronted in the king's court for riding out against the king's orders, and for not bringing back the 3 travelers trespassing in Rohan. Eomer threatens to kill Grima, and Grima has Eomer arrested. Eomer would be stripped of his armor and weapons and imprisoned for the next 2 days. On March 2nd, the 3 hunters, now accompanied by Gandalf the White, come to the Golden Hall.
Research
Grima is confronted, his treachery revealed, and Theoden healed. Your fingers would remember their old strength better if they grasped a sword hilt, said Gandalf. Theoden rose and put his hand to his side, but no sword hung at his belt. Where has Grima stowed it? He muttered under his breath. Take this, dear lord, said a clear voice. It was ever at your service. Two men had come softly up the stair and stood now a few steps from the top. Éomer was there. No helm was on his head, no mail was on his breast, but in his hand he held a drawn sword, and as he knelt, he offered the hilt to his master. How comes this? Said Theoden sternly. He turned towards Éomer, and the men looked in wonder at him, standing now proud and erect. Where was the old man whom they had left crouching in his chair or leaning on his stick? It is my doing, lord, said Hama, trembling. I understood that Éomer was to be set free. Such joy was in my heart that maybe I have erred. Yet since he was free again, and he a marshal of the Mark, I brought him his sword as he bade me. To lay at your feet, my lord, said Éomer. For a moment of silence, Theoden stood looking down at Éomer as he knelt still before him. Neither moved. Will you not take the sword? Said Gandalf. Slowly, Theoden stretched forth his hand. As his fingers took the hilt, it seemed to the watchers that firmness and strength returned to his thin arm. Suddenly, he lifted the blade and swung it, shimmering and whistling in the air. Then he gave a great cry. His voice rang clear as he chanted in the tongue of Rohan, a call to arms. Arise now, arise, riders of Theoden. Dire deeds await, dark is it eastward. Let horse be bridled, horn be sounded. Forth, Eolingas! Thus Theoden is renewed, and makes to lead his Rohirrim in battle against Saruman. That very day, Éomer sets out from Edoras with his king and his new allies as they ride north. The next day, they meet a scout, Kaorl, who had been sent by Erkenbrand to warn Éomer that Saruman had unleashed his forces, and an army of some 10,000 was heading across the Isen. As Gandalf rides out to find Erkenbrand, Éomer and Theoden lead their people to Helm's Deep, arriving that night. Éomer oversees preparations at the Hornburg as they await Saruman's army. That night, the siege of Helm's Deep begins, and when battering rams are brought to the gates, Éomer and Aragorn lead a group out through a side passage, driving back the enemy forces. During this skirmish, Gimli saves Éomer's life, killing 2 orcs who had ambushed him. Throughout the night, Éomer would lead the Rohirrim alongside Aragorn in defending Helm's Deep from the attackers. When the blasting fire of Saruman breaches the wall, the heroes are separated and forced to retreat. While Aragorn and Legolas would go to the Hornburg itself, Éomer and Gimli would be forced to retreat to the glittering caves behind the fortress. Thankfully, Gandalf the White would arrive in the morning alongside Erkenbrand and his 1,000 riders. Between the reinforcements and the Huorns of Fangorn, the Uruks are completely destroyed, and the Dunlendings surrender. Éomer would then accompany his uncle and the victorious leaders from Helm's Deep in traveling north to Isengard, where they confront Saruman. We are told that not only does Theoden not fall prey to the power of Saruman's voice, but neither does Éomer. He would then witness Gandalf break Saruman's staff, casting him from the Order of the Astari. While Gandalf and Pippin would depart the company for Minas Tirith, Éomer and the others would return to Helm's Deep, arriving on March 6th. From there, they would leave for Dunharrow. Aragorn would take a faster route, heading not only for Dunharrow, but the Paths of the Dead located there. Aragorn arrives at Dunharrow on the night of March 7th, while Éomer, Theoden, and the riders of Rohan arrive 2 days later on March 9th. At Dunharrow, Éomer would meet once more his sister Éowyn, who had been sent there with many people of Edoras when the army had set out to confront Saruman. After receiving a messenger with the red arrow from Gondor requesting their aid, Theoden resolves to ride to Minas Tirith. Éomer would ride alongside his uncle for the next 2 days, coming to the Druidan Forest on March 13th. The leader of the
missed
Druidine,
out.
Ganburigan,
Production of the
leads the
item is
Rohirrim by a
complete.
secret forest road to bypass an orc host upon the road to Gondor. The Rohirrim come to the field of Pelennor at dawn on March
Hostility
15th,
research complete.
and as Theoden issues commands to his marshals, he tells his
Military
nephew to
structure
follow the
complete.
king's banner down the center of the battlefield. The Rohirrim fight with great valor on the field of Pelennor, and they are both fell and fair. In the calamity of the battle, Eomer would next find his uncle as he lies mortally wounded. Then one of the knights took the king's banner from the hand of
Military
Gruthoff,
structure
the
complete.
banner bearer who lay dead, and he lifted it up. Slowly, Theoden opened his eyes. Seeing the banner, he made a sign that it should be given to Eomer. "Hail, King of the Mark," he said. "Ride
The
now
item is
to
complete.
victory. Bid Eowyn farewell."
Military
And so he
structure
died,
complete.
and knew not that Eowyn lay near
Logistics
him.
upgrade complete.
And those who stood by wept, crying, "Theoden King, Theoden King." Eomer tells his men to not mourn over much, for war yet called to them. Yet to himself he wept,
Production of the
bidding
item
Theoden's
is
knights to
complete.
remain with the king, to protect his body from battle. And he looked at the slain, recalling
Military
their
structure
names.
complete.
Then suddenly he beheld his sister, Eowyn, as she lay, and he knew her. He stood a moment as a man who is pierced in the midst of a cry by an arrow through the heart, and then his face went deathly white, and a cold fury rose in him, so that all speech failed him
Civilian
for a
structure
while.
complete.
A fey mood took him. "Eowyn, Eowyn," he cried at last. "Eowyn, how
Civilian
come you
structure
here?
complete.
What madness or devilry is this? Death, 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 take us all!" Then, without taking counsel or waiting for the approach of the men of the
We
city,
await your
he spurred
command.
headlong back to the front of the great host, and blew a horn, and cried aloud for the onset. Over the field rang his clear voice, calling, "Death, ride, ride to ruin, and the
Logistics
world's
upgrade
ending!" And with that the
Production of
host
the
began to
item is
move.
complete.
But the Rohirrim sang no more. "Death," they cried with one voice loud and terrible. And gathering speed like a great tide, their battle swept about their fallen king and passed, roaring away southwards. Eomer is shocked by finding his sister seemingly slain upon a battlefield, when he believed her to be many miles away in Rohan. He and his men would fight valiantly, yet soon find themselves trapped, surrounded by their enemies. Stern now was Eomer's mood, and his mind clear again. He let blow the horns to rally all men to his banner that could come thither, for he thought to make a great shield wall at the last, and stand, and fight there on foot till all fell, and do deeds of song on the fields of Pelennor, though no man should be left in the west to remember the last king of the Mark. So he rode to a green hillock, and there set his banner,
Our
and the
forces
white
have
horse ran
engaged the
rippling
enemy.
in the wind.
Production
Out of
of the
doubt,
item is
out of dark to the
complete.
day's rising, I came singing in the sun, sword
Civilian structure
unsheathing.
complete.
To hope's end I rode, and to heart's breaking.
are in grave
Now
danger
for
with
wrath,
our
now
armor.
for ruin, and a red nightfall. But as Eomer fights, laughing in the battle lust, king of a fell people making his last desperate stand, he sees the black-sailed ships were not captained by the corsairs. Instead, it flew the
Logistics upgrade
standard of the
complete.
king of Gondor,
Revenge
Aragorn,
awaits.
had returned.
We shall
As
do you
Sauron's
command.
forces face their defeat, Eomer meets Aragorn upon the field of battle, and it is said that Eomer, Aragorn, and Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth were unscathed. For such was
seek
the
minds
fortune
to make
and the
our
skill
own.
and the might of their
You will
arms,
find
and few
enlightenment in
indeed
death.
dared to abide them or look on their faces in the hour of their wrath. Soon after their victory, Eomer would learn that his sister was not truly dead, and she and many others would be healed by Aragorn. There, in the houses of healing, Eomer would call to his sister, and she would finally awake at hearing his voice. In honor of his service to both Eowyn and Theoden, King Eomer makes the wounded Meriadoc Brandybuck a knight of the Rittermark. The following day, March 16th, Eomer would meet Aragorn and the other captains outside the city to debate what should be done. Gandalf advises that they should ride with a great force to the Black Gate to draw out Sauron's armies. Aragorn agrees with Gandalf's counsel, and Éomer pledges to ride with Aragorn in thanks for his aid upon the Pelennor. 2 days later, the host of the West departs Minas Tirith, making their way north to the Black Gate of Mordor. They arrive on March 25th, 3019, and would make their last stand against Sauron, knowing not whether there was any hope that Frodo would succeed, or succeed in time for them to survive. Their faith and valor was rewarded, and Éomer bore witness to the downfall of Sauron. Following this great victory of the age, the men of the West set up camp upon the field of Cormallen, in the Gondorian lands of Ithilien. There they would celebrate Frodo and Sam. The victorious host would then return to Minas Tirith, and Éomer would attend the coronation of Aragorn on May 1st. Shortly afterward, he and Aragorn would renew the Oath of Eorl, the ancient bond between Rohan and Gondor, swearing everlasting friendship between the two kingdoms. 1 week after Aragorn's coronation, Éomer and his sister would leave Minas Tirith. Traveling with Elladan and Elrohir, the twin sons of Elrond, they would make their way back to Edoras for a short time to set things in order. On June 14th, the sons of Elrond would meet their father and sister traveling south and bring them to Edoras before escorting them to Gondor 2 days later. Roughly 1 month after leaving Gondor, Éomer would return on July 18th, and there he would put to rest an old quarrel with Gimli, who had earlier said he would fight Éomer were he not to declare that Galadriel was the fairest of all. Éomer said to his eyes, she was surpassed only by Arwen, and the two, who began ready to smite one another, would be great friends forever after. The following day, July 19th, Éomer would bring Theoden's body back to Edoras, and with a great many of their friends in attendance, they would hold Theoden's funeral in Edoras on August 10th. But amid the mourning is great joy, for Éowyn and Faramir are betrothed, with Éomer stating, "Thus is the friendship of the Mock and of Gondor bound with a new bond, and the more do I rejoice." After the feast, Éomer and Éowyn would have 2 more gifts for Merry. First is a name, Holdwina, meaning loyal friend in the Rohan language. And the second is the Horn of the Mark, an heirloom of the House of Eorl, held by their people for over 1,000 years. As for Éomer himself, he would also find love. In 3021 of the Third Age, he would marry Lothiriel, the princess of Dol Amroth and daughter of Imrahil. He had met her during his time staying in Gondor, and together they would have a son, Elfwine. As king, Éomer would change the positions of second and third marshals into a marshal of the West Mark and a marshal of the East Mark. He would name Erkenbrand marshal in the west and Elfhelm in the east. It is said that Éomer in the years to come would often fulfill the Oath of Eorl, riding to Aragorn's aid in battle, for many enemies would need to be fought in the east and south before the White Tree could grow in peace. Despite times of war, Éomer's reign would be one of great prosperity. He would come to be known as Éomer Eadig, meaning the Blessed. For during his rule, Rohan would recover from the hurts of the War of the Ring, and once more become rich and fruitful. Not only would Rohan be great neighbors to the Gondorians to their south, but they would welcome new neighbors within their very lands. Gimli would lead a group of dwarves out of Erebor, and with the king's blessing, establish a new dwarven colony in the glittering caves behind Helm's Deep. His friendships with Gimli, Aragorn, and Meriadoc would endure for decades to come. It is said that both Éomer and Éowyn sent Merry gifts when he became Master of Buckland in the 11th year of the Fourth Age. And 52 years later, as Éomer feels his days coming to an end, he asks that the great Holdwina would visit him one last time. Merry and Pippin would both come to Rohan, staying with the king until the fall, when at the age of 93, King Éomer dies. His son would take the throne, second king of the third line. Éomer's reign would be remembered not only for its great prosperity, but for its great duration. At 65 years, he was the second longest serving king
seek
of
minds
Rohan.
to make
He would
our
be remembered
own.
as a man of
We
unwavering
obey the
love and
Unity's
loyalty to his king,
Unity
to his
calls us
family,
to
and to
action.
his friends. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19,
Your
Lissamy
thoughts.
Lucinda, Rabbi Rob
Unity's
Thomas,
will be
Charles
done.
Leisure,
I
CCDC
am
Red
listening,
Team,
my friend.
Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Leo Vittori, Sky
seek
Carcass,
minds to
Slide
make
Belts,
our
Dane
own.
Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Z and N, Evely, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Next time on Nerd of the Rings.
Production of the item is complete. Our time has come. At last.
We seek minds
Today's
to make
video
our
is brought to you
own.
by Nerd Fitness. Ever have that feeling like you're constantly starting over on your fitness goals? Nerd
Defense
Fitness is
upgrade
here to help.
complete.
Stay tuned after the
The
video
item
for an
is
exclusive discount for my viewers. It is an office
their
made for
support?
counseling and serving the King of Gondor. Yet this
Come on
role,
now.
initially for simple management of lands, would become far more pivotal. For when the line of kings would fail,
Come
this
on in
office
and
would
jump
rule over
already.
Gondor for nearly 1,000 years. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the Stewards of Gondor. The office of the Steward of Gondor
You may
is
speak.
first established
Great
by
minds
Romendikil
think
I,
alike.
the
Our
8th
time
king
has
of
come.
Gondor.
The
Sometime
Unity's
during
will
his
be
rule
done.
from
Our fleet
452
is
to
trapped after
541 of
arriving
the
at the
Third
future
Age, he would select a
Revenge
person known for
awaits.
their trust and wisdom to take this role. The steward was notably never a member of the
Production
royal
of the
house
item is
and was
complete.
typically advanced in years, as he was not permitted to go to war or leave the
Unleash
realm.
our
The
wrath.
role as it is initially constructed involves primarily supervising the king's halls, houses, and lands.
Defense upgrade
While we know the
complete.
office of the steward would be established around the 6th century of the Third Age, it
Your
would be
bid
some
was
1100
insufficient.
years later that we would find the first whose name is recorded. This man was Hurin, from the lands of Emin Arnen. Named after the great hero of the First Age, Hurin's role would involve
are
far
exiles
more
no
than the
longer.
office had previously. He would serve as the chief counselor to the king in the Great Council of Gondor, a group made up of captains and
Military
lords from
structure
throughout
complete.
Gondor's lands and fiefs. The steward was also to rule in the king's stead should he be away from his realm. Likewise, the steward would be placed in charge when the king was ill or during the period between the death of the king and the accession of his heir. Another notable trait of Hurin is that he is of royal descent,
completion
for
of
he is a
this item
kinsman
makes us
of King
stronger.
Menardil, whom he serves. However, he is not related close enough for him or his descendants to claim the throne. Like the king, however, he could trace his lineage back to Anarion, brother of Isildur and son of Elendil. As for Hurin,
We are
his time as
exiles no
steward would
longer.
see one of Gondor's darkest moments, as he would play a pivotal role in ordering the kingdom during the Great Plague
Defense
of
upgrade
1635 to 1637. After his time, Menardil's heirs to the throne would choose their stewards from Hurin's descendants, rather than from other noble Gondorians. The next known steward comes some 200 years later. Serving under King Ondoher is Palendur. In 1944 of the Third Age, when the steward is 65 years old, the king and both of his sons die in battle against the Easterlings north of the Morannon. This leaves Palendur in charge of the kingdom until a new king could be chosen. And this comes at a pivotal juncture for both Gondor and the northern kingdom of Arnor, for there are two claims to the throne. In the north is Arvedui, the crown prince of Arthedain,